Hi, everyone. So we're going to get started with the auditory and language session. And I am excited to introduce our first speaker, Greta Tuckute, who's going to be telling us about a two-dimensional space of linguistic representation shared across individuals.
Awesome, thanks Janelle. Can you hear me fine in the back? Awesome, great. My name is Greta, and I'm really excited to share with you work that we've done on the key representational dimensions of language in the brain. And this is in collaboration with these wonderful collaborators. So we encounter all kinds of linguistic input in our daily lives. Some sentences convey concrete meanings. For instance, I'm standing by a white podium. Others convey abstract meanings. Attention is a limited resource. Some sentences are questions. Others are statements. And of course, there are many other kinds. Yet, we are able to successfully comprehend all of them. How do we do that? A set of left lateralized frontal and temporal brain regions support language processing, as illustrated by this probabilistic language map. All these regions respond selectively to language and show similar average activation profiles to different categories of linguistic input. So this leaves open a question. Is there any interesting substructure yet to be discovered, both in terms of response preferences and spatial organization across the cortex? There are many ways to structure linguistic input that we get from the world. So in this talk, I'll first ask, what are the main sentence dimensions that explain variation in brain responses? And second, how are those dimensions mapped topographically onto the cortical surface? These are the two key questions of my talk. To address these questions, we performed an ultra-high field fMRI experiment. We sampled 200 sentences from a wide range of corpora and topics and presented them auditorily to 8 participants in what is, to our knowledge, the first 7 Tesla condition-rich single-sentence dataset. We extracted brain responses within these large anatomical parcels that encompass parts of the brain that show activity to language. We selected reliable voxels, around 19,000 across all participants, and did data decomposition, PCA, to identify what we call sentence PCs, where each sentence PC indicates a sentence dimension that explains most variance in these voxel responses. To assess the robustness of these sentence PCs, we test which dimensions reflect common representational structure across human brains. We use a leave one participant out approach. We derive these sentence PCs from 7 participants, and then in the held out participant, we predict their single voxel responses using OLS regression and evaluate using the R-squared. And here's what we find. So on this y-axis, I'll show you the R-squared, and on the x-axis here, I'll show you how many sentence PCs are included in this OLS model, starting with none, so just the intercept, 1, 2, and so forth. First, let's do a sanity check. Because our analysis is cross-validated, we can look at the R-squared performance on the trained sentences. As demonstrated by this green line here, adding more regressors, more sentence PCs, improved prediction of the training data, as we'd expect. But the critical question is, what about the held out test data? How many of these sentence PCs generalized across individuals? And that is shown by the red line here. And here we see a very sharp plateau. 2 dimensions reliably generalized across individuals. Beyond 2, there's actually no improvement in prediction performance for held out participants. Together, these 2 sentence PCs account for around 32% of the explainable variance, which is a substantial amount, and there's variance left to be explained, reflecting dimensions that are unique to each individual. So these dimensions provide insight into the format of the shared representational space during sentence comprehension. But what do they encode? Can we characterize and interpret what information is actually conveyed along these sentence PC dimensions? To do so, we characterize each sentence along the many dimensions in which they differ, using targeted behavioral experiments and information theoretic estimates. We quantified how long sentences take to read, how surprising they are, how grammatical they are, how concrete their meanings are, and several other properties, 14 in total. I'll show the correlation of each of these two sentence PCs with these properties here on the y-axis. First, let's look at PC1. The bars here are colored according to whether the properties fall into two broad categories. Dark teal for properties related to processing difficulty, a sentence reading time, how surprising it is, and light blue for properties related to a sentence content. For instance, is the meaning concrete or not? And we see that PC1 correlates most strongly with the processing difficulty properties. So at one end of this PC, we have sentences that are easy to process, and on the other, those that are hard. And this processing difficulty dimension aligns with prior work demonstrating higher brain responses to unpredictable input. Next, let's look at PC2. Here we see that many of the content-based, the light blue bars, actually show the highest correlations. At one end of this PC dimension, we have concrete and visualizable sentences, and on the other, we have sentences that are abstract and hard to visualize. This means that these two PCs, these two dimensions, derived just from brain responses to sentences, are highly interpretable. And let me give you an intuition of the space, and don't worry, I'll zoom in. And here, every single dot indicates a sentence coordinates in this two-dimensional PC1, PC2 space. So here we are spanning the first PC from easy to process, it wouldn't be any fun otherwise, to hard to process, such as finally he was this past Friday. And the other dimension, abstract to concrete. Now, where and how are these dimensions organized on the cortical surface? Do we see any meaningful structure? Using this interpretable two dimensions we just discovered, we divided it into these 16 colored sectors. For each voxel, the OLS model estimates two weights, one for each PC, showing where it falls in this 2D space. So a voxel's color will reflect its tuning. For example, green voxels respond most to hard-to-process sentences, and so forth. This map shows the average of all 8 participant voxel weights onto the two sentence PCs, along with 3 example participants. I want to emphasize 2 points. The first one is that there's shared spatial organization across brains. This map does not look random. Rather, there appears to be some core systematicity across individuals in how these two dimensions are spatially distributed, demonstrating a large-scale organization across brains. Second, these brain maps are dominated by a subpart of the space, up here, meaning that across these frontal and temporal regions, most voxels are tuned to hard-to-process and abstract sentences. And as I mentioned in the beginning, it has remained unclear whether meaningful differences exist across these regions. Now we can directly compare the fine-grained voxel tuning profiles between regions, and here I'm comparing one representative frontal region and one temporal. In the frontal region, we see that most voxels prefer these hard-to-process sentences, and in the temporal, those that are abstract. For example, this population of voxel responses shown by this bar is the most dominant one in the temporal region here, and basically does not exist in the frontal region. So there's meaningful voxel level variation across and within regions, and variation that might be important for supporting distinct aspects of linguistic computation. And finally, I've focused on these frontal and temporal regions that are traditionally known to be implicated in language, but what about beyond? Interestingly, we also observed high predictivity in the ventral stream, an area associated with high-level vision. And furthermore, these ventral stream voxels show tuning to concrete sentences that are easy to visualize. And I want to remind you that there was no visual task in this experiment, so this might suggest imagery or multimodal integration. So to summarize, we found that processing difficulty and meaning abstractness define a shared representational space across individuals, and these form a large-scale spatial topography in frontal and temporal areas, with the meaning abstractness more prominent in temporal areas and extending into the left visual ventral stream. Is 2 all you need? Well, no. Of course, language is not two-dimensional. Individual specific dimensions exist, which we're exploring in ongoing work, and this opens up for new directions for studying inter-individual differences in how we extract meaning from language, with these 2 existing dimensions forming a core shared representational scaffold. And with that, I'll say thanks very much for your attention, and talk to me tomorrow or in the virtual world. Thanks.
we have time for one question as the next speaker is getting set up?
Just start switching.
Thanks for the great talk, Greta. I was just curious with the noise ceiling. I assume that's like within subject noise ceiling. I wonder if you looked at how well you could predict one subject's data from another subject's data, which would be not an individual difference because it's predicting someone else's brain, but maybe allows you to look at signal that isn't in the first two primary axes of variance.
Yes, thanks. Yes, it is within subject noise ceiling, so it's based on the 3 repetitions that every subject was exposed to. I've not looked directly at exactly that. I am exploring these additional dimensions in ongoing work, and actually you can see that sometimes there are 2 or 3 participants that seem to share a dimension that is not shared with the others, and that's why it doesn't come out in this like main analysis where you generalize across everyone. But yes, there are dimensions that either a couple of people share or just one. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so all other questions, find the speaker afterwards. So we're going to move on to our next talk, Disentangling of Spoken Words and Talker Identity in Human Auditory Cortex, presented by Akhil Bandreddi.
Awesome, thank you. So our brain has the complex task of having to extract shared information from varied representations of the same stimulus. So for instance, here on the screen, I have the spectrogram of 2 different individuals uttering the same word cat. Now, the shared information, the word cat is the same, but the way in which it's presented is different. Like you can look at the spectrograms, there's a lot of acoustic variation between the way the word is presented by both speakers. But however, our brain is able to effortlessly do this in a very natural way. So that is the broad question that guides our research, which is how does the brain code invariant information in speech? So first to do this, we need good data. So we have spatiotemporally precise intracranial EEG data, which we get from 14 neurosurgical patients who have these electrodes implanted in their brain to localize epileptic seizures. And these are from a combination of patients from the University of Iowa and the University of Rochester. And we have this across 167 sound-responsive electrodes. So once we have this data, we need an experimental paradigm to quantify this notion of invariance. So to do this, this whole paradigm works. So we start by presenting a stimulus, say the word cat, spoken by a speaker, and we record their neural response to it. Now, we present the same stimulus, but by a different speaker, and we record their neural response. Now, we do this over segments, so at each time point, we have a vector of responses across speakers. And then we correlate both of these vectors, and we label this quantity as invariant correlation. So the idea behind this is that if there's indeed a response that is identical despite acoustic variation, at some point from word onset, you should observe a correlation of 1. But this is IEG data, and it's not noise-free. So we need some form of noise correction. So to do this, we present the same exact stimulus from the first set again, and we correlate them to get a ceiling correlation, which is the noise-corrected version because we won't observe a perfect correlation of 1, but the ceiling correlation gives us a metric to compare our IC against to see how invariant the response is. These are all aligned at onset, and these are not presented in isolation. They're presented in random context so that we can make sure that this correlation is indeed reflective of the shared information that is being presented. In this case, same words by different speakers. And to visualize this, because we're doing this across a time course, we are going to get 2 time courses, one for our invariant correlation and one for our ceiling correlation. And intuitively, a fully invariant response would be one where the CC and the IC track each other closely or are ideally equal to each other from word onset. Now, we start by doing a single electrode analysis using this invariance paradigm. And we start by looking at the representation of word invariant to speaker, which is different speakers, same word. And here we observe, if you look at the bottom left electrode, that there are some showing some limited invariance where it's slightly going up towards the ceiling correlation, but there's some which are completely flat and show no invariance at all. And we do the same the other way around, where we're looking at representation of speaker that is invariant to word, where you have the same speaker but saying different words. And similarly here, if you look at the top row, you'll notice that some electrodes show limited invariance, where it's going up a little, and there's some which show no invariance at all, and there's some we observe that are in the middle. So after looking at this, we start by exploring the invariant neural dimension hypothesis, which is a very popular hypothesis of population code, very popular in vision, where if you look at the distributions under each of the electrode, you'll see that the distributions of cat and dog are highly entangled. But if we are able to learn a dimension which separates those two, a neural dimension, they separate out and you're able to see an invariant representation. Now, I just want to note that this looks remarkably similar to LDA. We are trying to learn a set of weights along a dimension to separate them. And while the intuition is same, the way we do this is very different because we're working with the IC invariant correlation, ceiling correlation quantities. So how do we learn this? So we do this by optimizing an objective function, which we set up, and then we optimize it using gradient descent. So our first target is we want the CC and IC to be close to each other, going back. The closer they are to each other, the more invariant the response is. But this is not sufficient because we often want to account for degenerate solutions. And one simple solution is both the responses could be flat, and that would be invariant. So a way to fix that is we add a term that maximizes reliability, and we have a hyperparameter that tunes it. But this is all learned in cross-validation, so we obviously want to make sure this generalizes to unseen data. So we add another term which maximizes the variance, which we also tune using a hyperparameter. And finally, we add log, and this is just an empirical adjustment to make sure no specific part of the loss is dominating the whole loss and that everything is balanced. Now, using this experimental paradigm and our invariant neural dimension method, we are able to uncover very strong invariant neural dimensions in both cases for representation of word, that's invariant to speaker, and representation of speaker, that's invariant to word. You can see that in both the plots here, where if you look at the IC and the CC curve from word onset, they very closely track each other. Now, just a quick summary before I go into future directions. We have this generalizable experimental paradigm to measure invariance, and it's important to note that we are interested in studying speaker and word representations, but this is a completely generalizable method which can be used for any form of invariance. Similarly, we have an equally generalizable method to extract these invariant components, given this, and similar to that, this is not specific to word or speaker representations, can be used for any kind of invariance. And finally, using this experimental paradigm and method, we're able to effectively uncover strong invariant neural dimensions in both cases for representations of words and speakers. So there are three main future directions we're looking at. One, for now, we're only learning one component, but it's obviously not true that these just exist along one dimension. They obviously exist in multi-dimensional space. And we would like to learn this using iterative deflation, where we simply just remove the projection of our component from the data and relearn the component again. The second one is testing for generalization and tuning, and this is to see if the components we learned are tuned for specific features. And one way to do this is, for instance, looking at past research, for instance, this paper by our PI Sam Nordman-Hegner, where we have these functional ROIs or even anatomical ROIs which are selective to certain things, for instance, like speech selective regions or non-speech selective regions. And we subset for electrodes, populations within these regions, and we apply a paradigm to learn the components within these subsets. And these can give us good insights into how these features are tuned. And finally, one natural question is, are these components just random components, or are they genuinely corresponding to what representations we're learning? So one way to do that is to look at whispered speech. So for instance, if I were to say the word cat and I whisper it, then I am effectively removing all pitch-based variation from it. So if two people were to whisper the same thing, then you cannot distinguish them in that dimension. And that's the hypothesis we test here, where when we take the speaker neural dimension and apply it to whisper speech, you can see that it's completely not invariant at all, where the IC is flat and not attacking the CC. But if you were to look at the word neural dimension, so if I were to say cat, dog, regardless of the pitch-based variation present in my speech, you are still able to effectively distinguish cat and dog. So if I were to take the word neural dimension and apply that to whispered speech, then it should generalize, and it does. And finally, another thing we do is we take the speaker dimension and we see if there's any clustering present. So in this plot, each line represents the average response of the component to a unique speaker in the stimulus, and it's colored by the pitch of that speaker who's uttering the stimulus. And if you look at the part from onset, which is at 0, to about half a second from onset, you'll notice that there is very strong clustering where the low-pitched and the high-pitched parts are clearly separated from each other. So to conclude, I'd like to acknowledge the authors on the paper, Sam Norman Hegner, who's my PI, Dana and David, who are postdocs in the lab, our collaborators at the University of Iowa and the University of Rochester Medical Center, without whom we wouldn't have this data, and the NIH and NSF grants which support this work. I'll be at poster C31 tomorrow if you'd like to talk further about it. Thank you.
Hi everyone, could the next speaker come up and we will take one question while we're switching over.
Thanks for the great talk. So just, sorry, this is maybe a silly question, but we're saying that the invariance is in the population code, not in the single, electrode. So is there something that you can say about that population, like how far it spreads or where the population is?
So that's one of the smaller drawbacks. That's one of the drawbacks of component analysis, where the weights we get out for the neural dimension are not interpretable. The level of interpretation we are able to do is we can look at what features or what tuning these components have. But with all component analysis, because these weights are to optimize for a specific objective function and the signs are completely random. We did try plotting them, but it doesn't give us any specific insights into specific organization of the weights. But the interpretability does come from seeing specific tunings or what features they correspond to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, now we are moving on to the next talk, which is by Pierre Guilleminot, who will be discussing the decomposition of uncertainty into dispersion and strength during speech processing.
Hey, hi. Thank you for coming to my talk. I am Pierre Guilleminot, and I am a postdoc at the Institute of System Neuroscience in Marseille, and I am extremely stressed. Regardless, I will present this work on the decomposition of uncertainty into dispersion and strength during speech processing, which admittedly is a lot of words. So I'm going to get into it. First, when I'm talking about speech processing, I actually mean word-level predictions. So there are no syllables, no phonemes, no acoustics. That's much simpler. And also, I'm only talking about predictions, so your ability as human to predict the next word. Like, for example, who let the dogs out? You shall not pass. Thank you so much. And these are very simple examples because I didn't want to flop at a presentation. But the truth is there are many, many complex mechanisms underlying this. Now, there are two issues with that. First, this is very complex, and two, I'm not clever enough to figure it out. So I sweep everything under the information theoretic formalism, and I just say, yes, your brain is a predictive black box. This black box is taking a certain context, so just a following of words, and it outputs a probability distribution of next words. And where speech is so interesting is that you have a never-ending flow of words coming in. So sure, you here you make prediction R half small, but then you get the new information which is added to the context. So you need to make a new prediction, and then you repeat that again and again and again. So new words, new probability distribution, new word, new distribution, blah, 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 blah. You get the gist. And interestingly, when you look at it this way, there are only two metrics that actually matter. So the information contained in the word you receive, so the surprisal, how surprising it is to actually hear that word, and the information contained inside of the distribution, uncertainty. Now, uncertainty is usually quantified using the Shannon entropy, which is the expected value of a surprisal. But if I were to show you this distribution of 32,000 words, it would be really hard to talk about it, right? So let's go to two events. This way it's much simpler. We can plot the whole entropy as a function of the probability of 1, 2 events. If the two are equally probable, then I am very unsure because I have no preference, and then as soon as you change, it's going to change. Fine, easy, simple. Now, let's look at 3 events. Then suddenly, let's say it's a murder case, and there are 3 different culprits, right? So A and B here have a 50-50% chance of being the culprits. And here, scenario 2, A and B have 12% and C have 76%. So which of these 2 scenarios is making you the more uncertain? Think of it. There are no wrong answers, by the way, just try to think about it. According to Shannon entropy, they have the exact same uncertainty. And the thing is, like, there are very different situations, right? So there's something here that is not quite captured by Shannon entropy, which is why we thought of introducing another metric, which is the Renyi entropy. It was introduced in the 60s by this mathematician. It's an eponymous measure, and basically it depends on one parameter, alpha, which kind of like show how much unlikely and likely events are weighted in regard to each other. So for example, if alpha is very small, then likely and unlikely events are kind of like considered equally. So the only thing that matters to you is the number of events that are non-null. And then if alpha is equal to 1, it's just the Shannon entropy. We're going back to a specific case. Great. And if alpha becomes big, the only thing that matters is the most likely event. You discard everything that is not the most likely prediction you're going to make. And so if we come back to our 3 event distribution, then sure, they still have the same Shannon entropy when alpha is equal to 1, but as soon as I change the balance between likely and unlikely events, then suddenly the uncertainty shifts. And they're not described by a single value, but rather by an entropy profile that is a function of alpha. Cool, but that's 3 events. Let's add a bit more events and look at, I don't know, 32,000, for example. I feed an LLM with an audiobook transcript. You've been hearing that the whole time. It outputs a probability distribution. I get the Renyi entropy. Cool, I use a predictive black box. And then on the other side, I use the actual predictive black box, which is your brain. I feed it with the same audiobook. And then brain alignment using Gaussian Kopel mutual information, yada, yada. You've been here the rest of the week. Okay, cool. So what does it look like? Well, it would look like this. So this is the uncertainty as a function of like the time course of a Gaussian mutual information for average across all channels. And looking at this, all the different plots are actually the different alphas. And here it seems that the best alpha is the small one. So the only thing that matters is how broad, how many words are possible. When I set out to do this project, I was like, oh, I'm going to find the perfect alpha. I'm going to find the alpha which maximizes brain alignment. And it seems that I found it. Except no, it's a bimodal distribution. Everything just became more complicated now. And also, Shannon entropy, we don't really care, actually. Well, that's fine. Then I'm going to introduce the dispersion in strength. And indeed, if we cluster according to the activity, we obtain those 2 time courses. So I'm not going to go into details here. The main idea is, on the dispersion channel, the mutual information, so the way uncertainty acts is actually pre-onset, early on, and then something that is akin to P300. And same for the strength channel, except you don't have all this early activity. And if you look spatially, well, it's intracortical data, so you can't expect something that is too good, but good enough. Dispersion channels are mostly localized close to Heschel gyrus. Okay, that's cool. We have a general idea of what's going on onto these channels. But what is also extremely interesting here is that the way uncertainty interacts with surprisal is not the same. On the dispersion channel, the addition of uncertainty and surprisal is sub-additive. So if you are expected to be surprised, you're going to be less surprised, kind of like in a sensory optimization way. However, on the strength channel, if you are expecting to be surprised, you're going to be even more surprised in a more information search kind of way. Cool, and that's basically what I'm going to leave you with. So in conclusion, Shannon entropy, not really represented during word prediction, and actually its uncertainty is represented as two different distinct forms, which are dispersion and strength. And these are respectively associated to, and when I say that in a very broad sense, early sensory processing and higher lexical processes. And what I do mean is actually different functions. Like, I don't want to put too much emphasis on that. Thank you very much for listening. There is a preprint. It hasn't been sent anywhere yet. So if you have feedback, anything, idea for supplementary analysis, I love doing that. And thank you for listening.
Very cool. Quite interesting to think about. So we have time for some questions. I might actually start with one. So I was wondering, as you were showing your entropy slides, like, is the best way to think about this that we are either surprised or we are not, or is that not a good way to?
So that's a very good question. It might be, like, so the thing is, like, there's a whole of the question between surprisal and whether it's like a semantic distance with what I was expecting. Is it an error signal? Is this error signal? So the thing is, I can't conclude on which one is the best. I can only say that the error signal and surprisal are very correlated with each other. And since I was mostly focusing on uncertainty with the whole information theoretic formalism that I use as a tool, it made more sense to use surprisal and not go onto the semantic distance territory. Yes.
I think that we have another question here. There should be time for it.
Thanks, this was really cool. Did you try looking at other kinds of surprisal, like phonemic surprisal or some other metrics? And what do you find?
Yes. So I looked at the phonemic entropy. What I found was that the only thing that mattered was the strength. There was no dispersion. I looked at the syllabic cohesion as well. Basically the same story, but mostly because syllabic and phonemic were very correlated. Like everything explained with syllables was explained by phonemes, so there was no additional activity there. It is still in the work, so yeah, but I have those figures for phonemes, and they're cool.
Okay, with that, we will move on to our next talk. So we next have Lars Kopel, who's going to be talking about pupil-linked arousal, tracking behavior, belief, updating in a dynamic auditory environment. Go ahead.
Hello everybody, my name is Lars Kopel, and today I'm going to present a project from our lab coined Pupil-linked arousal tracks belief updating in a dynamic auditory environment. I want to start my talk by giving a small example. So considering going to your favorite restaurant, and since it's your favorite restaurant, you're going to regard the quality of the food there to be pretty high. Hopefully the chef can meet this and these expectations every time you go there with a degree of natural fluctuation. However, at one day you're going to encounter a very disappointing meal, and you might give the restaurant 1 or 2 more shots, but at one point you have to consider the option that something has fundamentally changed in the world and maybe the chef has simply been replaced. This should prompt you to update your belief about this restaurant and prevent you of going there anymore. And this is a great example of how beliefs are guiding our behavior and how we sometimes have to update those beliefs if incoming informations are rendered them to be invalid. And our lab is interested in the question which neural circuits are implementing exactly this belief updating process. Influential computational theory is postulating that the noradrenergic locus is facilitating belief updating on different stages of the cortical hierarchy by exhibiting phasic activity towards surprising outcomes. However, experimental data on this is scarce. This is due to a few reasons. First of all, belief updating is difficult to assay in animals. Further on, noradrenergic activity is difficult to measure in humans. And in a task setting, strong report-related transients may mask pure belief updating activity. Therefore, we set out to develop a novel passive belief updating protocol, which is not in need of self-reporting and therefore addressing those problems. On the first glance, our protocol looks pretty similar to a classic oddball design, meaning that our participants, in this case 20 human beings, are listening to a sequence of 2 auditory stimuli, either 1 or 2 kilohertz pure tone, with one of them appearing quite often as a so-called standard, while the other one is just occurring with a probability of 10% and therefore acting as a surprising oddball. In contrast to a classic oddball design now, after every stimulus there is a 5% chance for a so-called state switch. So after state switch, the mapping of oddball and standards are reversed, resulting in a sequence pretty similar to this. You can now imagine that if you encounter the pink stimulus, the pink sound, at this position, it's not going to be very surprising to you, given its intermediate history as a standard, while encountering the very same stimulus here in state B, going to be very surprising as you experience this as an oddball in state B. If this is the case, we can assume that somewhere between those 2 points, some kind of belief updating must have taken place. But how do we measure exactly the surprise? We measure this by measuring pupil size at constant luminescence as an indirect marker of neuromodulatory activity. Now I want to show you the results of our study by first concentrating on what we call a steady state, which is always 2 stimuli away from the last state change. And at this point, we assume the participants to have formed a strong belief about the underlying state. So what you see here is the derivative of pupil size plotted against time points from stimulus onset, here indicated by this black line. And as you can see, that the response towards stimulus 1, here in pink, which is the standard in state A, is way smaller compared to the response to stimulus 2, which is the oddball in state B, here in blue. So the oddball component of our protocol seems to work. Now looking at state B, we see that this response difference is basically reversed according to the reversal of the oddball and standard mapping, indicating that our participants were able to pick up on this perceptual states change and actually updating their beliefs, which is cool. We next collapsed those time courses using a linear projection method to stimulus-wise pupil response amplitude, and then used those amplitude values to perform a repeated measure ANOVA, which yielded a significant interaction between state and stimulus identity, confirming our prediction. Of course, we identified then this oddball response to be actually a prediction error and not just a result of bottom-up repetition suppression in a many standard control experiment, not shown here because of time reasons. And then we moved on to look what is basically happening right after a state change. So by basically asking the question, how long does it take for a standard to reach a new steady state? And if you look at here at the pupil response amplitude plotted against the standard stimulus position after a state change, you can see that, of course, like the first stimulus is yielding a quite strong response, as it's probably perceived as an oddball, but then the strong response is decaying quite rapidly over the next stimuli until aligning with the average standard response, here indicated by this dotted line. To further investigate this integrative information process, we are utilizing an established Bayesian model for belief updating. This model is formalizing belief updating in a way that evidence is combined to prior to a certain posterior belief, and then this posterior belief is acting as the next prior belief in the next sample encounter. The core of this model is basically the so-called hazard rate, which is controlling exactly this transformation process, and nicely illustrated here in this figure from Glaze et al., and can basically be seen as an estimation of the volatility of the overall evidence, meaning that its hazard rate from 0, which is assuming a very stable world without any changes, is perfect to directly transfer the previous posterior to the prior, and therefore fully rely on this, basically doing perfect integration. While in more volatile environments like the ones we are creating here with our experimental sequence, it has been thought to be more effective to do this transformation in a non-linear process and therefore not fully rely on your posterior belief, but which basically makes you more sensitive to detect certain state changes. Now, using this model and using the probability we use to create our experimental sequence as the hazard rate of the model, we were able to calculate the so-called change point probability, which is a model-based measure of surprise for every stimulus. And if we then kind of like reproduce the standard after state change plot with those surprise measures of the model, we can see that the dynamics of the change probability are pretty much alike the pupil response amplitudes. This similarity motivated us to then run a stimulus-wise regression, which reveals this change point probability is correlating linearly with the pupil response amplitude. And now basically repeating this for change point probability values coming from models using different hazard rates revealed that the best correlation is found for change point probabilities coming from models using smaller hazard rates, all around like those 5%, which basically let us conclude that it seems like that our participants are implicitly establishing a pretty accurate estimation of the volatility of the incoming evidence, which is pretty cool, I think. With this, I want to kind of like quickly summarize the findings of our studies. So, pupil responds more strongly to local oddballs compared to local standards during passive listening to a dynamic auditory environment. After state change, it takes around 3 stimuli for the previous oddball response to align with the new steady state response. And pupil-linked arousal correlates with change point probability predicted by a normative belief updating model. Finally, pupil-linked arousal reflects belief updating in a modified passive auditory oddball protocol, which, looking forward, of course, have interesting new implications for belief updating research, especially concerning animal work as well as optimized human work, which then not require reporting anymore. With this, I want to end my talk and thank all the co-authors as well as the funding partners. If you want to talk with me about this research or just in general, come to poster C19 on Friday afternoon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Amazing. Great talk. We have time for some questions. Okay, I'll start with one as the next speaker comes up. So I guess I'm surprised that it only takes 3 stimuli for the response to align back with baseline. And so I'm wondering if to you that was expected, that it would align so quickly, or if if you could say a little bit more about that.
Actually, I was of course surprised for sure, but I think it's hardly depending on what kind of parameter you use to create the sequence. So if you create a more volatile environment, of course, like this integration process is going to be slower. If you like just have like a higher possibility for oddballs or for state changes, of course, it's going to change. I predict. I'm not sure. Gonna see.
So could you run an experiment basically where you're changing the volatility and see if the number of states change? Yeah, exactly. Very cool. I see a question in the back there. If we could run a microphone.
I already got a microphone.
Oh, great.
One of your key points of the presentation was that the task is implicit. There's a feedback here. Implicit and passive, and I like the task that you could come up with very much. But I would want to ask, how explicitly do you brief the participants about the task? Are they just listening and it's just happening to them, or do they kind of know a little bit about the probabilities and what is, because that influences how passive it is, in my opinion, a bit.
Yeah, exactly. So and I think that's the cool part about it, because they're not brief, right? They're just passively listening to the sequence, and it seems like this process is just like implicitly happening in the background.
Okay, and we'll need to hold all other questions for the poster session tomorrow. So the last talk of the session is going to be by Mengting Xu, who's going to be talking about auditory stimuli extend the temporal window of visual integration by modulating alpha band oscillation.
Hello everyone, my name is Mengting Xu and I'm from Ghent University. And today I would like to introduce my recent work about the auditory stimuli change the temporal window of the visual integration by modulating the alpha band oscillation. And we all know our visual systems have the difficulty in distinguishing the events that occur too close in time. And let's watch a video to learn about these limitations in the temporal solutions. And in this video, you could see a sequence of the fashion circles. And at first, you could see the individual flickers as they speed out, it stop feeling separate and begin to merge. And in order to frame this, Van Rura proposed the idea of the perceptual cycles. More precisely, if two consecutive stimuli align with the single perceptual cycle or single temporal windows, the two stimuli are more likely aligned with more likely to be perceived as the single event. If two stimuli align with the different cycles, and the people would likely to perceive them as the different event. And the key method for investigating the perceptual cycles is use of the neural oscillations. Actually, there is a study already confirmed that the alpha oscillation play a crucial role during the visual integration. And in this study, they used the double flash paradigm by presenting two consecutive flashes and asked participants whether they perceived one or two flashes. And they found if individual with the faster alpha frequency, the two flashes more likely aligned with the two different cycles. And there's a high possibility for the individual to perceive the two flashes. And if the participants with the slower alpha frequency, the two flashes more likely aligned with the single cycle, and also increase the possibility for the individual to perceive the one flashes. However, this study entirely focused on the unimodal visual processing, and in a cross-modal processing, there is a very well-known phenomenon called self-induced fusion erosion. And in these cases, the two flashes present consecutively, and the first flashes present with the single beep. And due to the auditory stimulation, people more likely perceive the two flashes as one. And this phenomenon leads us to think about the question, can auditory impulse extend the temporal window of the visual system? So in our study, we have two conditions. In the F2 condition, we represent two consecutive flashes. And in F2 beep condition, the first flash is present with the single beep, and then we present the second flashes. And as for the eyesight, we used the fusion threshold as the kind of eyesight to induce the bistable perception, and the fusion threshold determined as the point at which the one flash percept and the two flash percepts are equally likely to be reported. And regarding our result, first at the behavioral level, we find the beep boosts the fusion and shifting the threshold to a longer eyesight, and which means that the beep also extends the temporal integration window. And following this, we could see there is stronger alpha activity in the visual area, and which supports us to investigate instantaneous alpha frequency under two conditions, and we could observe there the F2 beep condition is much slower than F2 condition, and which means that the beep also extends the perceptual cycles. And all of this result leads us to think about question. If the beep indeed extends the temporal window, it might do so by extending the perceptual cycles. So in the following analysis, we also checked how much the beep shifts the fusion threshold versus how much the beep slower the alpha. And we could find there have a positive correlation between the two metrics, and which means that the more beep extends the perceptual cycles, the more it pushed the fusion window wider. And then we also would like to ask whether the alpha oscillation could predict the perceptual outcomes. So in the following analysis, we also checked the alpha frequency and alpha phase separately under two conditions. And first, in the F2 condition, we could find the perceptual outcomes is tied to the frequency difference, but not strongly to the alpha phase. However, in the F2 beep condition, we find the frequency effect is vanished. Instead, the alpha phase play a crucial role in distinguish the one flash percept versus two flash percept. And let's recap what we have seen so far. And we could observe the auditory stimulation decrease the post-stimulus alpha frequency, and also the difference pre-stimulus alpha frequency and the phase effect in the both conditions. So, what is underlying causes of this effect we observed before? Actually, they already have a lot of study confirm that the auditory stimulation can induce the phase resetting effect in the visual cortex. So we then suspect that the phase resetting effect might be the underlying causes of the effect we observed before. In order to investigate this hypothesis further, we integrate the phase resetting hypothesis and the perceptual cycle theory to build a computational model. And in this model, we differentiate the perceptual outcomes by whether the two flashes follow within one single cycle. And in these cases, you could observe the two stimuli aligned with the two different cycles, and this also increase the possibility for individual perceive the two flashes. However, if we induce the phase resetting effect in the auditory presentations, and it could be extend to the perceptual cycles and also allow the two stimuli aligned with the single cycles, and increase the possibility of the one flash percept. And by this kind of setting, we successfully replicate of behavioral neural results, and also which can help us to confirm that the phase resetting effect is this underlying causes of the effect we observe in real data. And summing up, our research not only confirms the rules of the alpha oscillations in shaping the temporal dynamic of the visual processing, but also offer a novel perspective on phase resetting. It's improved integration efficiency and also reshaped the temporal properties of the sensory modalities to meet the task demand. And in the end, I would like to thank to Lucy and Bill's help and the guidance in this study, and thanks to Tom and Midi and our other lab members' help in this talk. And my post will be presented in the CU169, and looking for any comments and questions about this study.
Amazing talk. We have a question right here.
Thanks. There was one thing I didn't quite understand. When you reset the phase, how does that make the alpha phase go slower afterwards?
So your question is why we reset the phase, the alpha phase decrease, right? Yeah, because you can imagine that actually we reset phase is let the phase replate again. So when the phase is, if the phase originally like in the window of like 1 millisecond, and we reset phase and extend the window to the 120 milliseconds. So that is why the frequency decreased, because it becomes more slower. So the phase change also more slower. So it's why the frequency decreased.
We have a question back here. Did you get a microphone?
Hey, thank you for the really interesting presentation. I think it's really cool what you show, and then, I study post-diction, and I think it's a really nice piece to the puzzle of how information after a stimulus can influence how you perceive it. But I'm wondering why do you think that, what's the reason why an auditory stimulus could prolong the integration window? Because surely, regardless of whether there is an auditory stimulus, you would want to wait for additional information. Like, why would it increase the probability of waiting and slowing down the brain?
Yes, as I showed in my previous slides, and actually there's a lot of study already confirmed that the auditory induced the phase resetting effect in the visual cortex, right? And we could. And we also can observe that the increased the interchild phase coherence in our real data, and which can provide us to support us to investigate the phase resetting effect. because the phase resetting effect can extend the temporal windows. So we also could observe the increased intertrans-fixed coherence in the F2 beep condition compared to F2 conditions. So we suspect that this might be the underlying causes. So this is why we would like to investigate that.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so I think that we're going to need to hold all questions until tomorrow at the poster session. So all of the talks today have posters tomorrow afternoon. Let's give one final round of applause to the speakers.